RadioShack was once a household name, a go-to store for electronics enthusiasts and everyday consumers alike. Founded in 1921 as a humble radio parts shop, it grew into a retail giant with over 7,000 stores at its height. Yet by the mid-2010, this 94-year-old company had plunged into bankruptcy and practically vanished from the retail landscape. How did an iconic tech retailer go from industry pioneer to cautionary tale? This is the dramatic story of RadioShack's rise, its shocking collapse, and the lessons learned from one of the retail sector's most infamous failures. RadioShack's origins date back to 1921, when brothers Theodore and Milton Deutschmann opened a small store in Boston to supply amateur radio enthusiasts. They even chose the name RadioShack, after the term for the small shacks that housed a ship's radio equipment, a fitting choice for a company serving radio operators. In its early years, the company built a loyal customer base of hobbyists by selling radio parts and kits through its one-store operation and mail-order catalogs. By 1939, RadioShack issued its first catalog and expanded into high-fidelity audio equipment as electronics gained popularity. Despite some early success, RadioShack hit hard times by the early 1960s and was nearly bankrupt. Salvation came in 1962 when entrepreneur Charles Tandy purchased RadioShack for just $300,000. Under Tandy's leadership, the company shifted focus to the broader electronics hobbyist market. Tandy slashed unprofitable product lines and opened many small, no-frills stores that catered to tinkerers and do-it-yourself tech fans. This strategy paid off. Through the 1970s and 1980s, RadioShack rode the rising tide of personal electronics. It launched its own popular products, notably the TRS-80 personal computer in 1977, one of the first mass-produced home computers. Backed by a nationwide store network when dedicated computer shops barely existed, the $600 TRS-80 exceeded sales expectations and made RadioShack a player in the early personal computing boom. By catering to both electronics newbies and die-hard techies, RadioShack grew into a ubiquitous presence in malls and main streets across America. By the end of the 20th century, RadioShack had transformed from a single Boston radio supply store into a global electronics retail empire. At its peak in 1999, the company operated over 8,000 stores across the United States, Canada, Mexico, Europe, and beyond. Nearly every town in America had a RadioShack, and often more than one. This massive expansion drove impressive financial growth. RadioShack's annual sales climbed steadily, surpassing $5 billion by the mid-2000s. 1. In 1998, the company declared itself the world's largest seller of consumer communications products. 2. Stock price hit an all-time high in 1999. 3. By the mid-2000s, RadioShack was worth roughly $3 billion on the stock market. The company's ubiquity and past success gave it enviable brand recognition. For generations of Americans, RadioShack was the default destination for batteries, wires, gadgets, and the latest tech toys. However, cracks were forming in RadioShack's foundation. The very factors that drove its growth, a huge store footprint and a focus on in-person gadget sales, would become liabilities as technology and consumer habits changed. The beginning of the downfall, strategic missteps as the 2000s progressed, RadioShack struggled to adapt to a rapidly changing electronics market. One major issue was failure to embrace online retail. While Amazon and Best Buy aggressively expanded digital sales, RadioShack remained heavily reliant on physical stores. By the time RadioShack tried to build an e-commerce presence, it was already too late. RadioShack had too many stores, many absurdly close to each other. In California, 24 RadioShacks operated within a 25-mile radius of Sacramento. RadioShack shifted away from electronics hobbyists and DIY tech users. Instead, it focused on selling mobile phones and service plans. While this initially boosted revenue, profit margins were thin. Traditional tech customers abandoned the brand as fewer stores stocked resistors, capacitors, and DIY kits. RadioShack was now competing with Best Buy, Walmart, and Amazon without a clear identity. As the business struggled, RadioShack went through a revolving door of CEOs. In 2006, CEO David Edmondson resigned after it was revealed he had lied on his resume. Frequent CEO changes and inconsistent strategies led to a lack of clear direction. In a highly criticized move, RadioShack laid off 400 employees via email, drawing public outrage. RadioShack was hemorrhaging money and customer trust was crumbling. The final collapse and bankruptcy. By 2014, RadioShack had posted 11 consecutive quarters of losses. Foot traffic in stores was declining rapidly. Stock price collapsed from over $20 per share to just pennies. Market value of the company shrank from $3 billion to just $28 million. RadioShack filed for bankruptcy in February 2015. Thousands of stores were closed, and Sprint acquired some locations. Just 2 years later, RadioShack filed for bankruptcy again. Nearly all remaining company-owned stores were shut down. The once multi-billion-dollar retailer was reduced to a handful of independent stores. Lessons learned from RadioShack's failure. 1. Adapt to market changes. Failing to embrace e-commerce left RadioShack obsolete. 2. Don't abandon your core identity. RadioShack alienated its loyal tech hobbyist customer base. 3. Avoid overexpansion. Too many stores led to high costs and internal competition. 4. Strong leadership matters. Frequent CEO changes and poor strategy accelerated the downfall. 5. Customer experience is key. As service declined, so did customer loyalty and sales. RadioShack's rise and fall is a cautionary tale of how even the most successful companies can collapse if they fail to innovate. The RadioShack name still exists, but its legacy is a lesson in business survival. Those who fail to adapt to changing markets are destined